Financial Argument. Follow us on YouTube.
And with us today is John Rubino from DollarCollapse.com. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, Elijah. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, I'd first like to discuss about another article that you recently wrote. You were talking about how rising inflation coupled with the rise of populism is very bullish for gold. Can you expand on this?
Sure. Basically, one of the strange things about this recovery is the lack of inflation relative to the amount of money that the governments have been creating around the world and how far down they pushed interest rates. You know, in any previous cycle, if you'd pushed interest rates into negative territory and created tens of trillions of dollars of new cash and just tossed it into the market, you would have had this rip-roaring inflationary boom. And we didn't get that. So economists, at least Keynesian economists, are scratching their heads trying to figure out why their policy prescriptions haven't worked to the extent that they expected, to the extent that their models say they should. And the reason is that we borrowed so much money in the past, and a lot of that debt has gone bad. In other words, a lot of people who borrowed money in the past can't pay it off, and that's very deflationary. So we've had to create this much new currency and push interest rates this far down just to offset the deflationary impact of what was a historic debt crisis in 2008, 2009. But we kept at it. We kept adding money to the system. And, you know, just in the last 12 months, the U.S. government borrowed another $1 trillion. And Chinese banks wrote about $1.8 trillion of new loans. And the European Central Bank created about 1 trillion new euros and pumped them out into the banking system. In other words, we put the pedal to the metal. In just the last year, financially, we stepped it up. And it started to work, finally. You know, Japanese inflation has gone positive just lately. It was negative. In other words, they were in deflation for the past few years. Now they're starting to have mild inflation. Eurozone inflation is running at levels that are above the target level of the European Central Bank. U.S. inflation is around 2% now, which is what they were originally aiming for. So we've got price instability now all of a sudden, where we used to have, over the past few years, basically prices not changing, which is a disaster for an over-leveraged society. Now we've got prices starting to rise again. And the Keynesians are happy, but they don't seem to grasp how unstable a system can be. Once you create a lot of inflation, it takes on a life of its own. You know, you can't just move inflation up to 3 or 4%, keep it there for a couple of years, and then move it back down. You don't have that kind of control over what is basically a system that runs on emotion, the global financial system. And so we're heading into a period of rising economic instability as prices start to rise, and that affects the bond markets, which in turn affects the money markets and the stock markets. And at the same time, while all this is going on, the sense has been growing among regular people that the system doesn't work for them anymore. You know, all this bad debt hurt individuals, but helped the big banks. You know, they've gotten bigger and stronger and more powerful. Stock markets are going up. The rich are getting richer because their assets are going up in value, while regular people are seeing their wages go down, their healthcare costs go up, and everything else get worse. So they are all of a sudden, in the last couple of years, willing to listen to politicians who express this idea. You know, they stand up there and say, listen, the system is broken. It's crooked. It doesn't work for you anymore. We're going to tear it out by the roots and start over again with something that helps you at the expense of the 1%. You know, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen in France or the Brexit guys in the United Kingdom. All of these guys are speaking to that sense of dissatisfaction, and voters are responding. Even if, for instance, in the Dutch election, the populists didn't win last time around, the election they had a couple of weeks ago, they still gained ground, and the mainstream parties lost ground. And this will continue, because as long as the mainstream parties are in power, nothing is going to get fixed. It's only going to get worse. So this trend towards populism and away from the right-left dichotomy in major country politics is going to continue. Brexit and President Trump were not the end point in this process. They're just the beginning. And that means we're going to have political instability feeding into economic instability, because whoever we elect, whatever populist we elect, is going to do some extreme stuff because that's the platform they're running on. And in a lot of cases, that will destabilize the system because there's no actual fix. They're running on a promise to fix things, but you can't fix this kind of debt. All you can do is make it worse one way or another. So politics will feed into finance, which in turn will feed back into politics. And we've got this feedback loop now in which the system gets more and more unstable. In other words, a political upheaval leads to a financial crisis, which leads to another political upheaval, and so on, until the system starts to spin out of control. And that's what we're looking at in the next few years. There isn't a path from here to some kind of a stable system as we remember from the 70s and 80s and 90s, where you grow organically and debt is more or less under control. That's not the kind of thing that we can get back to without extreme pain. And so we're seeing that assertion play out in both the financial and the political arenas now. It wouldn't be a surprise if we have a huge bond market dislocation at some point here, where inflation starts to pick up and people realize that a bond yielding 1% in a world of inflation with 3% is an incredibly bad deal. And so they don't want to hold that kind of paper anymore. So the governments of the world are forced basically to buy up all their own debt. In other words, the central bank balance sheets have to expand even further, which means they have to create more currency, which accelerates the process of rising inflation, and so on. And so you get this huge bear market in bonds, which leads to a bear market in stocks, because rising interest rates make stocks, which sometimes pay dividends, look worse in comparison, and stocks are liable to go down. You can see that kind of thing where we are back at 2008, 2009, only on a bigger scale with much, much bigger problems, because we've basically doubled the amount of debt in the global financial system since then. China, the US, Japan, and Europe have all added immensely to the amount of debt in the world. And the big banks have gotten even bigger. The derivatives books are even bigger. The leveraged speculating community now has this huge bet on interest rates to the tune of several $100 trillion, which means that half the people in those bets are going to be on the wrong side of whatever happens to interest rates in the next few years. And some of them won't be able to pay off. They'll stiff their counterparties. Those counterparties will go bust. And you get something like what almost blew up the global financial system in 2008, 2009. The difference being that governments of the world already took on immense amounts of debt to prevent 2008, 2009 from turning into a 1930s style capital D depression. So they're much more leveraged now than they were back then, which means they have less ammunition. It's harder to leverage yourself if you're already leveraged. And for instance, Japan's government debt is now something like 230% of GDP. That's a record. No country has ever had that much debt at the government level and gotten away with it. The U.S. has doubled its national debt twice in the last two presidential administrations. Bush doubled the U.S. debt. Obama did it again. And now Trump is on track to do it one more time, because the current budget that he's laid out calls for huge increases in infrastructure spending and defense, and an attempt to offset it by cutting the rest of government, which won't succeed, because it's much harder to cut spending than it is to increase spending. So the way it normally works is governments propose a budget that offsets spending with new cuts, but they never get the cuts, and they get more spending than they expected. We'll do that again. So the system, which is already incredibly unstable, just made itself a lot more unstable over the last few years by borrowing huge amounts of new money. That now is starting to manifest as rising prices. So if we get inflation that goes from 2% to 3 or 4%, which it has the momentum to do that now, the system would just start to spin out of control, because all of a sudden central banks would be forced to start raising interest rates. And if you raise interest rates, in a highly leveraged system where so many big players are basically loaded up on variable rate debt, either debt that directly fluctuates with interest rates or debt that has to be rolled over, as most governments have done. They borrowed short term, so they have to roll their debt over periodically. The U.S. has to roll several $1 trillion of debt over per year, for instance. So if we raise interest rates in order to lean against accelerating inflation, then the debt costs that basically every major actor in the financial system is saddled with, that goes through the roof. And so you end up blowing up a lot of big players. You know, the stat that's scariest is, of course, Japan, where if they just had to pay on their debt what the U.S. government now pays, their interest costs on their government debt would exceed their entire tax take. In other words, the government would take in, however many $1 trillion they take in, and have to spend it all on interest. They would have nothing left over for military or social spending or anything at a time when their population is aging and their social spending is soaring. So the system would break down. We've got stuff like that all over the world, where you can point to a government's balance sheet or a corporate sector or a banking sector that is just completely untenable if anything changes from today. And lots of things are going to change. So I think the next thing to watch probably is the French election. It's coming up soon. Marine Le Pen is a populist in the Donald Trump mold who would take France out of the euro and out of the EU if she had the power to do so. And it looks like she's going to come in first or second in the first round of voting, and then second in the runoff that they're going to have. That's what current polls say. But a Marine Le Pen victory isn't all that much less likely than a Trump victory was, or Brexit winning. And those two things happened. So we could easily see France become the epicenter of the next political / financial crisis out there. Because if France pulls out of the Eurozone, the European project, as it's currently configured, is basically over. And that means all those euro-denominated bonds out there are going to end up being revalued as drachmas or lira or French francs or pesetas or something like that at big discounts. And so the big banks take losses. It goes on and on. You can start with a premise like that and then trace it through the secondary and tertiary effects to get a gigantic crisis. And you can start basically anywhere and go through the same process and get a crisis. The US, Japan, China, which we haven't talked about, but they're in the middle of a gigantic currency crisis right now that they're not sure what to do about. So it goes on, and the end result is something pretty horrific financially. So I don't know what the answer is for it. Well, actually, there is no answer politically or economically. You can't fix what is now broken. So as individuals, our challenge is to accept that we can't change things by voting because the system has this institutional momentum that's taken us off a cliff. And we have to focus on fixing or protecting our families by organizing our finances in such a way that we're more or less protected from what happens. And historically, for instance, gold and silver have done really well in these kinds of financial crises. So has farmland and other really well-chosen, non-leveraged pieces of real estate. You don't want to buy a San Francisco condo because you think real estate is going to be protected from the financial crisis because it's something like that is highly leveraged and could go down by 80% at least in real terms when a crisis hits. But a rental house that didn't cost you very much to start with and is in a college town that's very stable and there's always demand for student housing, et cetera, et cetera. Something like that is a much better thing to own than a portfolio of government bonds, for instance, in this kind of an environment. And it's way less risky. What used to be considered risky or safe, like government bonds and cash in the bank, suddenly are highly risky assets. So you have to make that mental transition away from what used to work, buying Apple stock and just riding it, or buying government bonds and knowing you'll be safe, stuff like that, which mainstream financial planners have always told us. and have been true in the past are no longer going to be true going forward. So that's the kind of thing we have to get used to, is that the world is changing and we have to evolve our financial lives along with this changing world.
Now, to summarize, basically what you're saying is electing these populist candidates isn't actually going to fix anything. Instead, it's simply going to add political instability to the already present economic instability. So how do you see that, how do you see that playing out, and what kind of, I mean, it seems like you're saying that inevitably this will lead to collapse. What will that look like?
Well, it can manifest in a few different ways because, we've got history to draw on here. In some ways, this is unique because we've never had the whole world screwing up in this way at the same time. It used to be that individual countries would borrow too much money, create too much currency to cover their debts. The value of their currency would plunge. They would have a big crisis. They would lop off a few zeros from their currency, issue new money, and go forward. And that's how it would play out. But it played out on a stage of sound money. Everybody else had gold and silver coins as their currency, or at least gold-backed paper. So the world went on as before without too much disruption. Well, this time around, everybody has fiat currencies with unlimited printing presses, and they're all making the same mistakes. So we've got a global version of what used to be a localized crisis coming. Now, the political turmoil that we're seeing right now is people opting for change because they see the status quo not working. But the change that's coming, anytime you elect somebody who's an outsider, who's willing to tear the old system up, in other words, a revolutionary, you necessarily get turmoil because revolutions aren't placid things, So it might be Bernie Sanders or someone like him being elected who wants to go the socialist route, where he basically makes everything free by having the government pay for it and tries to raise taxes on rich people. Well, that doesn't work. We've tried that a bunch of times. And capital basically just goes on strike. So the wealth creation process of free markets grinds to a halt. The system goes broke. And that's the end of that experiment. If we try the other route, where we set up kind of an authoritarian system, like with, for instance, Hitler, to take a really extreme example, or the fascists in general, Mussolini before Hitler and prior to World War II. You have the government trying to control the economy by partnering with or controlling capitalism, and that doesn't work either. So the populists who are going to get elected going forward are going to try a lot of different things. Populism isn't just one philosophy that you can point to and say, oh, it means this with taxes and this with military spending. It's not like that. It's just guys who are coming in and saying, okay, the little guy's being disadvantaged. We're going to skew the system back in favor of him. And they can do it in lots of different ways. And the fact that we will probably see the left and the right get to try out their prescriptions going forward means we'll have a lot of conflicting stuff going on. At the same time that we're in the middle of a gigantic debt crisis, because anything that spooks the markets, whether it's from the right or the left, what Trump is trying to do now will probably at some point spook the markets, but so will what, for instance, Podemos in Spain, the very left-wing party that might take power at some point in the not-too-distant future. What they do will also spook the markets. So I would view the political stuff that's going on right now as a symptom of the problem rather than the problem itself, because the fact that we're willing to elect way out of the mainstream parties and candidates means that the financial system is no longer working. And because those guys don't have any prescriptions that will actually fix anything, because there is no way to fix this much debt without wiping it out somehow, we're going to see a series of crises in which finance feeds into politics, politics then feeds back into finance by causing a lot of turmoil. And that's just going to be the landscape going forward until the system breaks down. And that could happen sooner rather than later, because we shouldn't have gotten here in the first place. We owe more money than seems reasonable, and that we've gotten here means that the system is poised to collapse and could happen anytime. There could be a catalyst out there, for instance, the Italian banking system collapsing or some flare-up of Middle Eastern war or a disruption in the oil market, or any number of things could happen to tip us over into crisis, so that all the stuff I'm talking about doesn't matter anymore. We won't have to watch 10 years of political turmoil build up where one country elects somebody who throws everything up in the air, and then 2 years later somebody else does it. It doesn't have to happen that way. It could happen much more quickly, where the financial system just breaks down. So you can't know going forward how this plays out with any kind of certainty. And again, it comes back to you as an individual. How are you going to structure your finances so you're as insulated as possible from what is going to be some kind of turmoil? You can't know the timing, and you can't know the specifics, because all of that is inherently unknowable, because it depends on the decisions of people who are under incredible amounts of pressure and who are in most cases operating with flawed models. So they don't know what they're doing. They have no idea what they're going to do until the situation presents itself. So we can't predict what they're going to do in the moment. And that means that you want to hide out, basically, financially. And, I keep coming back to finance because the political thing is unfixable. And the financial thing on a macro scale is also unfixable. We're heading off that cliff. There's nothing we can do about it because we've already done the damage. We've already taken on insane amounts of debt that have to be worked off either through inflation, which is inherently destabilizing, or a debt-driven collapse, which obviously is destabilizing, or one then the other. We can't get out without those things happening. So I think for a lot of people, it might even make sense just to stop paying attention to the news anymore. You can't fix it. There's nothing you can do about any of this stuff. But you can convert your bond portfolio into gold and silver. You can buy a rental property and manage it for cash flow, something like that. So tend your own garden, and you'll probably be doing the best that you can for your family. And that's not to say don't stand up against injustice when you see it out there, but it is to say don't obsess over things you can't change, because there's nothing you can do as an individual voter or any other kind of small-scale political actor to stop the financial crisis that's coming. And if you can't stop the financial crisis, you can't stop the political turmoil that naturally flows from it. So it's kind of in one sense, a very depressing message, but in another sense, it's kind of almost restful. If you can stop feeling responsible for what's going on in the world and start focusing on what you can control, that's psychologically a lot more healthy. I think after Trump was elected in the U.S., you saw a lot of people almost have breakdowns, because all of a sudden there was this stuff going on that they flat out couldn't control. And to them, it was horrifying. So they felt really powerless because they had a sense that they should be able to control it. And I think that's a false sense at this point. We can't fix any of this. So we have to focus on the things that we can fix and the ways that we can protect ourselves. And there are a lot of ways to do that. Fortunes are made during crises. And if you make the right decisions, you can not only come out of what's coming with as much as you went in, but orders of magnitude more than what you brought into it. And again, one way to do that is gold and silver, and the mining stocks that the companies that extract gold and silver and then sell it into a increasingly strong market. Stuff like that will do very well, and it's accessible for the average person. So that, at least personally, that's how I cope with a world that's spinning out of control. I focus on the stuff I can do and the opportunities that it presents, and there are a lot of them.
All right. Well, John Rubino, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we let you go, did you want to share with the viewers any last thoughts you had and where they can find you online?
Well, yeah, I run dollarcollapse.com, which chronicles a lot of this stuff in sometimes excruciating detail. And my most recent book, The Money Bubble, covers a lot of this stuff also. It's co-written with Gold Money's James Turk. And, it was written a few years ago, but it was too early. So now most of the stuff that's predicted in the book is finally coming true, which means the book is timely still. So that's available on dollarcollapse.com or on amazon.com or any other online bookstore.